Hello, welcome to MasterChef Engine Edition. Today we're going to be cooking up a Japanese masterpiece, the Saito FA-45 Special, and it's going to be perfect. I've got all my ingredients laid out in front of me, so here's what you're going to need. A freshly prepared Saito FA-45 Special. This one's been stripped to all its components, given a really good soak in acetone and a really good scrub to make sure they're all perfectly clean. Front and rear bearings from SKF Japan, the links are in the description. Some gasket paper for that really tricky rocker cover gasket, and some oil, preferably 3 in 1. Our first task is to preheat an oven to 200 degrees Celsius. We want to be prepared because once this gets going, everything comes together really quickly. First step is to take your shiny clean crankcase, put it on a baking tray and get it in the oven for 20 minutes. Make sure it gets nice and hot, that's really going to help us get these bearings in. While that's cooking, we want to get prepared with our crankshaft. You're going to need your crankshaft, your new rear bearing, your spacer and your pinion gear. I'm going to give the crank a nice treat to some oil here, get it well lubed up and ready to go. Just use your fingers, get in there, get messy. First thing is to slide your main bearing right over there. Probably going to require a little bit of force to get that in place. Make sure it's nicely seated home. A satisfying little click will do. Next up, take your pinion gear and align it to the roll pin. Again, sliding it in until it's home. And then, lastly, your spacer. And that's ready to go in. It's so simple. So we want our crankcase really hot, so I'm going to use this simple vise to hold it once it's out so I don't burn myself. The first thing we're going to put in is the front bearing. We want this in first so that we can assemble everything else from behind. Okay, this has just come out and it's super hot, so we want to work quite quickly. We're just going to try and push that in there. Drops in perfectly. While that's still really hot, we're going to move around to the back of it. Try and push in the rear bearings. Super hot, so I'm just going to grab something to push with. And there it goes. The front one's come out, so we're just going to push that back in. Make sure everything goes right where we need it to. It's no good, I'm going to drop the act. It's far too much effort to carry on pretending like I actually know what I'm doing and that I'm not getting help elsewhere. I managed to deform the prop spacer, the tapered collet for the prop driver, and got some help from Mark Robinson, who kindly advised me on how this should actually go together if you do actually know what you're doing. So thank you very much, Mark Robinson. Mark informed me that the best way to get these tapered collets on is to position it down and try not to force it, which is what I did, and use a prop and the prop nut just to squeeze it all home. I tried to install it while the crankshaft was still warm. It had obviously heat soaked from the casing, and I managed to deform the collet by trying to force it on when it clearly wasn't ready to go on. But fortunately, thanks to Mark's advice, I was able to save it and I didn't need to spend £20 on a replacement. But by using his method, I just widened the collet slightly, got it to seat home, placed the prop driver on top of it, and used a prop and the prop nut just to squeeze it all home. And this is now really nicely on there. There's no play, there's no slop, and it's spinning nice and freely. So I'm going to drop the pretense of this MasterChef idea. I mean, poorly executed, I know, but could have been a good idea if I knew what I was doing. So I'm going to continue with the rebuild and talk you through all the bits, but just without that silly pretense. So actually the bottom end went together quite easily. With the casing as hot as it was, the front bearing just dropped in, and the crankshaft with the rear main bearing did push in okay, but it ended up pushing out the front bearing, which I then had to tap back in, and in that time the casing had cooled a lot more, so it took a bit more work to push back in, and in the process of pushing that in, I knocked the crankshaft out again, which left the main bearing in, but pulled off the pinion and the spacer. So I had to then push the crankshaft back through the main bearing, through the pinion and the spacer, get it all locked in and push it through the front, by which time it was getting really quite cool. So the bearings weren't coming out, which was positive because I had to tap the crank home. Long story short, it's in and it's spinning nicely. The prop driver and its taper collet are on, and I have saved having to replace those. So let's move on. Next up, I'm going to assemble the camshaft and its carrier. So we've got the cam gear, the shaft, the 4 retaining screws, the housing, which have the cam followers in it. I popped them back in for safekeeping, the original gasket and the shims. So first things first, I'm going to again get a bit of oil on the shaft here, just to make sure everything is going to slide on nicely. A bit of a tight squeeze there, and I think I might just be able to push it in if I use, oh no, that's gone in position. I may need to use something just to poke it down. A small flat bladed screwdriver should do it. Just to get it lined up over the centre. There we go. And I can see that that is in. Or maybe not. There we go. What I didn't check is whether that flat spot was at the top. So I pushed it all the way through a little bit there, and you can see I've now got the flat spot on the top ready to key in with that grub screw. So I'm just going to push that flush and tighten that grub screw down. So that's in there spinning freely now. Again, I'm going to add a bit of oil to the end points to make sure we've got nicely lubricated camshaft there. So what I can now do is line up the notch in the camshaft with this side here. It's the only one it will line up with, and then I can use a screwdriver to hold that in position. I need a slightly thicker shaft. I wonder if an Allen key is going to be better. Certainly need one with a pointy end. Going to go with it. Just going to make sure that that's clean and get that pushed in and lined up. And you can just feel it settle into that notch and lock it in position. Have the camshaft, the crank at top dead centre, the camshaft in position, and there we go. That is now correctly timed. So now that's in, I'm just going to rotate it a couple of times and just verify that once it comes round again, when that's at top dead centre, I line up with the hole, and that appears to be the case. A nice test to check your timing is just gently rest a screwdriver in and rotate your crankshaft, and when it lines up top dead centre, the screwdriver should just drop into a notch, and you can see there the screwdriver's moving. The crank is at top dead centre. There's a little bit of play there because the screwdriver is larger diameter than the hole, but it's not enough to be a tooth out, so that is good enough for me. Next up, I am going to assemble the cylinder and piston. It's a one-piece cylinder, so there's no head or head gasket to remove. I'm reusing the same piston ring. It's in good condition, it still has good spring to it, and a good way of checking that your piston ring is still the right size and shape is just to put it into the cylinder and check. A tiny little gap is okay. If this was a car, I'd have a feeler gauge and be checking that gap. You want a bit of a gap so that there can be some adjustment in expansion and contraction, but the main thing is that it forms a good seal around the whole of the piston, and that there is a little bit of a gap there. You don't want it completely end to end because that will break, and you want a little bit of a gap to allow, as I said, the expansion and contraction. I'm going to pop a little bit of oil in the groove. That's just going to help it help me put it in properly and seat it nicely. Now, car rings have a top and a bottom. They often have an angled chamfered edge. This doesn't. This is a completely flat ring, so I'm just going to put it on. I'm just going to put one end in and just pull it round and feed it in, just widening the ring as it goes round, and that's in. You want to give it a good spin, squeeze it, make sure it's fitting freely, and that's ready to go in. I'm going to drop a little bit of oil on the cylinder bore and just give that a swoosh round. The conrod has a dot on it. That's the front of the conrod, should be facing to the front of the engine. And I've not removed the conrod from the piston, so I know that orientation is correct. I freed it up after cleaning it, and I'm just going to pop a bit more oil on there just to make sure everything's nicely lubed before the first start. So I've got the dot on the ring on the conrod there, and that will go forwards. And I'm just orientating the piston ring the same way, and I'm just giving it a squeeze, and we should be in. There we go, and that moves nicely. There's good compression there. If I cover the hole and push, get some really good compression. So that means the valves are seating nicely. I've not removed the valves to clean them because, knowing me, I will lose either the collets or the springs. They'll shoot off around the garage and I'll never find them again. So they looked serviceable. I've cleaned them from the inside and out, and I've just left them be there. Next task is to just pop that onto the bottom bearing. Again, I'm just going to put a bit of oil around that. I'm going to rotate it to top dead centre, feed the conrod in and slide it into position. Now I can rotate to bottom dead centre and push the cylinder down in place. There's no head gasket on that. It's an interference fit with the bottom of the cylinder bore, and I need to find the bolts for that, which don't seem to be in the bag. It looks like they're in the crankcase bag. I must have had them on there. I'm just going to tighten them diagonally, this side, that side, this side, that side, in a cross fashion, just to nip them up, get a bit of clamping force there evenly across the mating surfaces. If I was to do one side tight before the other, you could introduce some warping load or some uneven pressure on the mating surfaces, and either break the casting or you just won't get a seal. Like I said, this is the cylinder bore sits in. There's no gasket mating surfaces here, so it won't be too much an issue with this engine, but it's good practice to get the torque evenly distributed. There we go. So already you can hear There's some good compression there. That's with the exhaust wide open. Cover that up again. Build up some pressure. It's going to be good. Now I'm going to install the push rods and the rocker arms and the push rod guides. I've got two small 1/2 inch lengths of heat shrink tube which are going to replace the rubber boots that had perished, the rubber seals on the lower end. These will do exactly the same job, and is a really good tip I saw. If you don't want the expense of ordering and buying the replacement boots, these will do exactly the same job and look very, very similar. When it's in the model, you're not going to know any difference. They will effectively clamp around and seal around the guide tube and the cam follower tube as well. I think what I'm going to have to do is loosen up the head and lift that up to get those in, because it seems too much of a tight gap. Next I'm going to install the rocker arms. I've already installed one to familiarise myself with how I'm going to do it, but when I took it apart I didn't separate these or mark them as left and right. But fortunately when I did take them out, I put the pins in the same direction they came out from, and that means that they only go into the head in one direction, so that means that by that method I can orientate left and right. So all I'm doing here, I'm putting a drop of oil on the pin to lubricate that, placing the rocker arm in position and sliding the pin in. Can be a little bit fiddly if you have bigger fingers like myself, but ultimately it's simple as putting a round peg in a round hole. I've been applying a little bit of pressure to the rocker arm just to get everything lined up, and once it's in to the arm, the screwdriver helps to bring it into place. It's gone in nicely. And I'm just going to screw that down hand tight. Valves are now operating and opening and closing. Very nicely. Just going to put a drop of oil on them just to keep them nicely lubed up before restarting the engine at a later date. Next up, I've just got to try and remember how to assemble the carb. I think this is going to require the use of a little bit of Googling. I cleaned up all the black paint that was flaking off of the exhaust. We're just left with the brass there, and I think that looks great, so I'm happy with that. It's no good, I need to get a diagram. Quick Google and found an exploded diagram, and it's not as complicated as I thought. Actually very simple. This tapered spring drops in there, and the main throttle valve goes over the top of it. That gives it the spring return that it needs. Then we have the collar that acts as a detent on the needle adjustment, and a nut to hold that in place. All simple so far. Have the high-speed needle slides in and screws in, and you can hear the detent arm there spring just letting us know we're turning it. So that's in. I will do all the setup on it and adjustment at a later stage. Next, I'm going to screw in the throttle stop. There is a groove on the barrel here to guide the throttle in and out. There we go. So it's keying on that throttle stop screw, and the taper on the barrel is pulling it in and out, assisted by the spring. And what happens is when I screw the stop in there, it opens the gap very, very slightly to give you a kind of a bypass bleed. I've got what looks like 3 O-rings here. We have 2 rubber and 1 Teflon, and they go in the following places. The Teflon one sits in a little groove under the choke plate to seal that off. Otherwise you would get air leaks when you didn't want it, and the choke would be quite useless. And so that now seals very nicely. Then the other 2 are for the intake tube. The thicker one is for the head end and seals with the washer on its backside. The second one, the smaller of the 2, sits into a groove inside the, it might actually be the other way around, a groove inside the intake tube of the carb itself. You're going to need something small and pokey to get that in, like a thin screwdriver. Let's try the other one. And of course any area that's not sealed here is going to give an air leak and mean it's difficult to tune and will run rough. That looks a lot better in there now, like it's, yeah, and there's a positive seal there. Now I'm just going to double check the orientation, make sure everything's going to go where I want it to, and that looks good. So let's just put the O-ring on the top, place that in position. There's a small spacer that spaces out the carb body, and then we have our 2 bolts to hold it in position. And there we go. The last thing to do is the valve clearances, and I'm going to try and find my feeler gauges, but if not, I have a dial gauge and I'll use that because that will be a more accurate way of getting the tolerances between 3 and 5 thousandths of an inch. Right, I couldn't find my feeler gauges, so I've gone more accurate and I've set up my dial gauge here. And what this jig is doing is just measuring the lift, the free play between the rocker arm and the valve. And if I just push on the push rod end here, we can see that actually the free play there is about, this is a metric gauge in 100th of a millimetre. We've got about 400th of a millimetre play there, which by my Googling works out about 1.5 thou. And the minimum for this is 3 thou, so we're on about half. We want about 400th of a millimetre, I think, unless I'm getting this very confused, but effectively I want to adjust this so it's got double, and that should be the minimum clearance we need. So obviously requires just a very small adjustment. Okay, that's just coming up on 5. Okay, so on double checking this, you want the valve clearances between 2 and 4 thou, and I have set this to 0.06mm, which is about 2.5 thou, so I'm happy with that. 6 or 7, 0.06 or 0.07 would be fine, and this repeatedly falls in that range. So I'm happy with that. I'm now going to move on to the other valve. So we're almost done. I've just given it another good clean with the toothbrush and acetone, and there's one final piece to put on. That's the prop washer and the prop nut. That's all my bags empty. Everything's been stripped, cleaned and rebuilt, and it's ready for a test run. I'm hoping to do that in the next couple of days. I just need to order some more fuel. Struggling to put on a nut at the last hurdle. There we go. And I'm really looking forward to hearing this engine run. As I said in the last video, linked up above, this is my first 4-stroke, it's my first Saito, so I'm really looking forward to what this is going to sound like and how it's going to perform. I've even stuck the 45 Special badge back on there, so I'm really pleased. I'm hoping this is going to purr like a kitten, or a lion, roar like a lion, a full throttle purr like a kitten at idle. That would be lovely. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Please do like, share and subscribe. Happy flying.